podcast, an inside look at California politics in the state legislature. I'm your host, Assemblyman Josh Hoover, and I'm very excited to be joined today by two wonderful people from CalBroadband. We have Janus Norman, president of CalBroadband, and Amanda Gualderama, director of legislative and regulatory advocacy at CalBroadband. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Thanks for having us.
you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, excited to have you guys on to talk about everything broadband in California. So that'll be a really interesting topic. But before we dive into it, would love to, introduce yourselves. Amanda, we'll start with you. And,
Sure.
How'd you get into the world of broadband?
Well, thank you again for having me. Very happy to be here as a constituent of Mr. Hoover's. So World of Broadband, I've been with CalBroadband now just a little over a year. Before that, I did about a decade of insurance lobbying. Before that, I was a workers' comp attorney. And before that, I was an intern in the state assembly with Assemblymember Alan Mansour. So that's kind of how I got.
That is a ways back.
It is a ways back.
That's awesome.
Dating yourself.
Yeah.
But to be fair, it's also where I met the now assembly member.
That's right. Yeah, that's where we met.
Yes.
Exactly. I remember that too. That's so awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's where I got my
I
first
forgot you were
taste.
an attorney too, so that'll be helpful for this, hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah.
You can get into that lawyer brain because I'm definitely not. So
Yeah, it's different.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. I know that was I forgot how long ago that was, so that's awesome.
I know. Thank you for aging me.
Hey, I was there too. We were both there. It's all good. We're not old. It's fine.
Of course not.
Yeah. What about you, Janus?
So I've been in the world of broadband now for 2 years.
Yeah.
Joined CalBroadband after a pretty good stint with the California Medical Association.
Awesome.
Representing the physicians of California. Before that, I was with ASME. It's a public sector employee union. Represented a diverse set of employees, from school employees to city workers to state physicians and a multitude of other. We used to say from A to Z.
Yeah.
And then before that, worked in the California Judicial Council, represented the court system, helped increase people's fees and fines so we could pay for new courthouses.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure people appreciated that when they got speeding tickets. And then before that, worked for the state assembly budget committee and then personal staff for then Assemblymember Darrell Steinberg. So I'll age myself.
Okay, so you
as well. Yeah.
I think he wins.
I think he does too, which is good.
Then Assemblymember, then Senator, now Mayor.
Now Mayor. Yes.
Many.
You're old when you could say, I knew him when.
Yeah, when he was just a lowly assembly member. That's amazing. Yeah, that's
definitely
cool. Well, it's cool. So we've all kind of worked in the building, and I feel like it definitely gives you good insight into now where you guys are at now, obviously lobbying and working in the broadband space. Well, I want to get into, broadband and everything broadband. But before we do, I want to poll the listeners. We usually do a question of the week.
Okay.
So this week's question is going to be, and I'll give some background on it, but the question's going to be, should the legislature ban or prohibit the expansion or security screening company Clear at California airports? Now, for anyone that missed this story, if you haven't heard about it, there was a bill introduced to essentially eliminate this company Clear, which basically, and I'll let Janus talk about it more, but it basically allows you to skip ahead in the screening process if you go through a certain security, overview or whatever, and pay a fee every year. So this legislation would ban that practice. If you want to vote on this poll, you can go to our Twitter page at Point of Order Pod. So that's where the poll will be posted. But do you guys have any experience with Clear?
So yeah, I'm biased. I have a Clear membership. As someone who travels, not insignificantly, I wouldn't say a lot, but I travel frequently. So about 4 times a month.
Okay.
The ability to get in and out of an airport is really important to me.
For sure.
So I will say, in defense of Clear, it's an extra level of screening that you subject yourself to.
Yeah.
So they do a thorough background check. You have to give some biometrics, so your eyes and your thumbprints. So I'm thoroughly in the system now.
Yeah.
And then because you subjected yourself to that, you can then sort of get expedited access to the.
So do
to
you
the front
just
of the
you
line.
go into that clear line?
Yes.
And then you just go to straight to TSA or what?
Yeah, so you go through the clear line. They either check your eyes or your fingerprint,
Okay,
make
got
sure you are you.
Got it.
You're still subject to random searches, so there
Okay.
could be an additional screening once you get to TSA, and then you either go to the regular TSA or TSA pre-check.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
if you sort of think about it from a systematic standpoint,
Yeah.
you've got regular TSA, which is
Right.
generally open to the public.
Sure.
You have TSA pre-check, where
Extra screening.
Extra
through
screening,
the government or whatever. Yeah.
you also pay a fee for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can get clear, which is an additional layer of security screening
Yeah.
and a fee. And so, it's kind of customizable
Yeah.
depending on how much you travel and your desire to get in and
Yeah.
out of line.
I just think it's funny. Like I don't know. One of my colleagues, I won't say who, tweeted that we just have way too much time on our hands in the legislature that we're even talking about this problem. So maybe we shouldn't even be, talking about it on the podcast. But the reality is that I do think it's kind of a nitpicky bill where it's like, hey, I'm TSA pre-check.
Yeah.
I've never been a clear member. I just haven't wanted to pay for it because I don't fly enough.
Yeah.
But like I don't envy them. Like, yeah, sure, it's cool, but they pay for it. They can have it. It's like a toll lane, right?
Yes.
Yes.
It's like
Yes.
you're like, hey, I need to get through this traffic quicker today. I'm paying. Tomorrow maybe I'll wait because I'm not late or something. You know what I mean? Like,
to be clear, I'm always running late.
So
and
am I,
so,
to be- yeah.
so clear makes sure that I get to the plane on
there
time.
you go. Yeah.
So, I can understand why
Yeah.
it's a discussion.
Yeah.
We've been dealing with lines since we were, kindergartners and preschoolers.
Yeah.
And the notion of cutting in line is generally not accepted.
It
But in
is,
this
yeah.
instance, it helps me make the plane.
That's right. Well,
So-
and anyone can pay for it in theory, right? If they want to.
Theoretically.
In theory,
Yeah.
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 But I do think it's funny. It's like the adult version of like he's cutting, which
Yes.
is funny. Have you done clear? at
Oh,
all?
absolutely.
Yeah,
So I'm,
okay.
again, biased, clear member. I also love that I don't have to pull out my driver's license every single
really?
time. Yeah, because they scan your eyes or your
Oh,
fingers.
okay.
And so I'm not ruffling
pretty
through
cool.
my purse and then trying to put everything back before
Yeah,
I
yeah,
have
yeah.
to scan things through. So
You guys might be like creating a new member of Clear after this. I don't know.
Yeah,
You're talking me into it.
I would like to amend the bill to limit the number of clear customers they can have because I don't want my line getting long.
right. Can we be grandfathered in? And then no one else
This
can
No
do
is
one
it.
else.
sounding a lot.
Yeah, it
like
is about
a
me.
carpool lane
Yeah.
or something. Like, this is that's pretty funny actually. So the bill actually, it was heard this week. It got passed.
Okay.
But it was amended pretty substantially. So the original bill would basically ban Clear in California. The amended version basically prohibits Clear from expanding to any additional airports.
Oh, additional airports.
after it goes into effect. Yeah.
Oh,
Oh.
okay.
Which is obviously better. I still don't like the bill, but I think
Yeah.
like obviously there's a lot of people have problems with the bill.
Yeah.
So they're amending it pretty substantially. But
Okay.
yeah. So should the legislature ban or prohibit it? You can go to Twitter @PointOfOrderPod to vote on that. I think like we were talking earlier before the show started about San Diego Airport,
Yeah.
and depending on what airport you're in, I imagine Clear is even more handy,
Yes.
right?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
It makes a big difference
Yeah.
when you go to LAX,
Oh, I bet.
depending on the
Yeah.
time of day.
yeah.
Again, to be able to get through the line. I mean, if I was a responsible adult, I'd get there 2 hours early, like they tell you to do, but I'm not doing that. I have Clear.
Yeah, I know. But there you go. All right. Well, I mean, LA. Yeah, I try to avoid LAX anytime that I can. Go to Burbank or something.
Yeah.
makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Long Beach is really nice too.
Mm-hmm.
I flew my son for the first time by himself. So he
Oh.
went from Sacramento to San Diego.
Okay.
So I was trying to walk him through, like, hey, when you get there,
Yeah.
this is what you're gonna see. So I pulled up and he made it. He was cool.
Okay.
But he tested it out. He's never flown alone. And
That's awesome.
He's
Awesome.
15, so he's not
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
he's not like little.
Yeah.
But it's still kind of scary because
Yeah.
he's just
Yeah.
like, I don't know where I'm going. So yeah,
And teenagers don't always pay attention. So
that is for dang sure. I know you did that firsthand. So yeah.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about just CalBroadband generally. Like, tell us about CalBroadband, what it is, what your mission is.
Yeah, so CalBroadband is short for the California Broadband and Video Association. The association itself has been around since 1962 and it's had a number of different names. But most recently, it was the California Cable and Telecommunications Association. The name changes just reflect the change in the nature of the business and
Yeah.
services that our members continue to provide. So we consist of the 11 cable broadband providers in California.
Okay.
Everyone from your Comcast or Cox or Charter Spectrum,
Yeah.
Mediacom, so on, all the way down to your smaller members like Orion, which is only in North County, San Diego. So our members have that perspective on the type of technology that they use.
Okay.
We don't represent like the traditional telephone companies. So, we don't
Sure.
represent AT&T or the wireless providers like Verizon or T-Mobile. They belong to different trade associations, but we work hand in hand with them often
Sure. Yeah.
on legislation. But our job is really to make sure the voices of that cable industry is really represented in the legislature and before state agencies like the California Public Utilities Commission or recently BARB.
Mhm.
Wow.
So,
That's interesting.
yeah.
So, Amanda, I'll ask you because for, people that might not know when you say broadband, like what do we mean from a technology standpoint? Because you
Yeah.
mentioned, Janus, like
Mhm.
the telephone and all that stuff, but what
Yeah.
are we talking about when we talk about broadband?
So there's generally 4 different types of technology that provide internet, right? So there's and we'll go by the history. So traditionally there was the telephone companies that, historically provided your
So
DSL.
like DSL,
We all remember that sound that started up the internet and
Yeah,
you
the
couldn't be on the
dial-up.
phone while you were on the internet.
Remember
So
those days?
yeah, it's gotten better. Then there were our companies, the cable broadband providers that brought it to you through that cable coaxial technology.
Mhm.
Then the wireless folks got involved in broadband. Now that you have your smartphone, everyone has internet on their smartphone, and now they're even going in home with fixed wireless, so you can get your internet from them as well at home.
Got it.
And then the newest one on the block is the satellite providers. So you have Starlink and
Oh,
Amazon
right.
doing broadband to the home through their satellite.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot of different options.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, broadband refers to a speed in which
Okay.
data moves.
Yeah.
The FCC adopts the speed.
Okay.
Um,
Like minimum requirements. and
minimum
stuff like that? Okay.
requirements. And they recently updated the minimum
Mm.
requirements to be 120. So 100 megabits per second download,
Okay. Yeah.
20 megabits per second upload.
That's a lot faster than they used to be.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
it used to be 25.3.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of California programs and policy continue to be based on 25.3.
Okay.
So the update that the FCC has done hasn't sort of made its way through all the different policy requirements. But it's the definition of speed which allows for multiple technologies to be able to reach that speed
And compete. Okay.
and compete. Yep.
Really interesting. Yeah. That's good stuff. I remember, the dial up back in, I don't know, it was like late 90s, early 2000s.
Yep.
But I remember my parents stuck with broadband dial up for a long time because they didn't, want to move into the 21st century or whatever. And I remember the Giants, I think, made the World Series in like 2003 or something, and we still had dial up.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was like, Dad, if I can get on there and get tickets, can we go? He's like, yeah, if you can get them. So I'm on there with dial up, trying to compete like at 10 a.m. or whenever they went live, trying to like, come on. And like they were gone. They were gone so fast. I was just living in a different world than everyone else.
Yes,
And-
you were.
And I was like, all right. I was like, we're not going to the World Series, Dad. I didn't get tickets. That's all right.
You would have had better luck camping out in front of the ticket
I think I
booth.
would have. I probably, that would have been much better playing.
Yes.
But, it's all good. What are you going to do? They lost anyway, so it doesn't matter.
It's
Because you weren't there.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So tell us a little about like where we at, like state of broadband in 2024. What are some of the big issues you guys are facing and kind of the things you're looking at?
Well, generally speaking, the vast majority of Californians have access to high-speed internet or broadband.
Sure.
Depending on what maps you're using, the data can range anywhere from 97% to 93, 94%. So generally high 90s
Okay.
in terms of the percentage of people that have access to one or more providers of high-speed internet in California. The question that has been raised beginning in the pandemic, post-pandemic, is how do you move from 97% to 100%? And what does that look like in terms of the combination of technologies that you need to use, the participation of state and federal government in sort of changing the business dynamics of how you lay or roll out the infrastructure, which is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. And that's really the question now is how do you get from 97% to 100%? You've had multiple efforts. And by that, I mean, you've got multiple rounds of state grants that are pure state funding.
Yeah.
So a handful of years ago, California passed SB 156, which was essentially an $8 billion package. That package sort of divided the question of how to provide broadband into two parts. There was money set aside for a state-owned open access middle mile. We can talk more about what that means if you want. And then there was money set aside for last mile projects. What's most important in that discussion is that the last mile is what actually connects the home.
Right,
Middle mile is really computers talking to computers. And there's a wide range of opinion on how much middle mile you actually need in the state.
Yeah. Interesting.
And where geographically you actually need that middle mile to connect computers to computers. But our focus has been on, those last mile projects, because the last mile projects are what enable a household to actually connect to high-speed internet.
Right.
Few years after SB 156 passed, the federal government got involved, passed the BEAD program. BEAD is $42 billion nationwide. California got 1.8 of that.
Wow.
That money is being administered by the Public Utilities Commission.
Our favorite.
Yes.
We've talked about the PUC a few times on this podcast.
Yeah.
But we won't go into it here.
Yeah, we'll be very measured in what we say about our friends over at the PUC. But that money probably won't get allocated onto the quote unquote onto the streets until probably next calendar year.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you timeline. Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
As they sort of figure out how they're going to develop the rules have to get approved by the federal government.
Okay, got it.
So you've got money sitting at the PUC, so $2 billion in what's called the FFA, but just last mile, keep it simple. You've got $2 billion in state funds sitting at the PUC for last mile projects that has not yet been spent. And then you have an additional $1.8 billion in last mile projects as it relates to the BEAD money that has not yet been spent.
Wow.
So the state of broadband in California in terms of state funding has been on pause for like 3 years. Legislature, you and your colleagues have expressed frustration over that and have sought answers to why that is so. I mean, right now, especially for the FFA, it's a $2 billion program. $4 billion in projects have been submitted.
Wow.
And money's not out the door.
That's amazing. Yeah. No, a lot of work to be done there for sure. And I know for the listeners, I am on the Communications and Conveyance Committee, which we have a lot of these discussions. I know we've had oversight hearings and, trying to figure out how do we actually allocate these dollars and get those projects going so we can meet these goals of obviously getting access to the people that don't have it. Amanda, I'll ask you, because I know we've talked about this a little bit, kind of tailing off of that is the restrictions around how this money can be spent. Like, obviously, in the ground line, last mile to a house in a rural community probably might be cost prohibitive. is there an ability to use different technologies to meet these goals, or is it like, is it more difficult than that?
So it depends. So the FFA, like he mentioned, has a preference for those wireline the technologies, whether it's in the
Right.
ground or on the poles.
Okay.
And then the bead also has that preference, but depending on where you are, where the project is located, you can make the case to have that fixed wireless or even satellite
Okay.
provide the service if they can meet the speeds that we were talking about earlier,
Right.
at 120. So, you know, I know there's been folks making the case that these things should be technology neutral.
Yeah.
Because different areas will be a lot more expensive if you're doing the wireline to the
Right.
premises.
Yeah, it's tough. It's like, and I always tell my guests too on this show is like, I sometimes editorialize, but I'm not expecting anyone else to. But like, one thing that I found that's been kind of frustrating is that, I think the goal is obviously access,
Mhm.
and the goal is, I think, speed requirements, like meeting certain requirements.
Sure.
Those two things are really good goals. I think beyond that, the technology, it's like, hey, like maybe that house out in the middle of nowhere might be better with satellite or better with, fixed wireless. And so it's just like allowing that flexibility, right? Is some of the conversation we've been
Yeah.
having in the legislature where it's like, the goal is access, right? At the end of the day.
Yeah.
My family, my wife's family grew up she grew up out in Ione, like in the
Oh,
kind
yeah.
of Amador County, right?
Mhm.
And like they didn't have like a broadband line until like 10 years ago or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was like, it was
Yeah.
crazy, right? So
Yeah.
in some ways, you're going to be waiting a long time, if that's what you're waiting for, right?
Well, and even
So,
though, we are at either the 93 or the 97%, those
Yeah.
last few percentage points are going to be extremely expensive
right,
to get broadband too. And
Right.
so even though we have the $2 billion in FFA and the $1.8 billion in the BEAD, that's not going to cover. The CPUC estimated $9 billion to get everyone have full access to
Yeah.
the internet.
Wow.
And so we're not even close to the amount of money that we need to get folks connected.
Yeah, incredible. One question I get a lot, and so broadband can now run like phone systems, correct?
Mhm.
Am I
Mhm.
like okay?
Mhm.
So one question I get a lot. So there's a discussion going on. And I know it's been affecting my district, or at least I've heard from a few folks that it's not in your wheelhouse. It's AT&T, but they're talking about
Okay.
getting rid of their copper lines,
Yes.
right? So this is kind of a big discussion that's
Yeah.
happening now.
Yeah.
Granted, those copper lines only cover a couple percent of, or
Correct.
a very small percentage of at least my district.
Yeah.
But they do, cover some folks still, and some people are really clinging to those lines. They feel they're more accurate for 911 response, stuff like that. What have the kind of advancements been on like the 911 side and like the emergency services side? Because I know for a few years that was kind of a challenge or
Yeah.
whatever.
One, we don't represent AT&T, so that's just
Of
a full
course,
disclaimer.
of course. Yeah.
And our association hasn't taken any position on the request.
Yeah.
But from a 911 standpoint, a lot of improvements have happened.
Yeah.
Particularly, there was a concern about 911 from a wireless perspective. And
got
when
it.
you make a call from a cell phone, where does it go? Does it go to
Right.
your local dispatcher? Does it go to CHP?
Yeah.
My understanding is that they've been able to create, for lack of a better term, triangulation
Okay.
technology that
Yeah.
can pinpoint where you are.
Okay.
And so a lot of advancements have been made,
Yeah.
whether you're using voice over internet protocol, which
Yeah.
people call VoIP, which is
Yeah.
what our members provide,
Sure.
or wireless. If you're able to dial 911, they can find you,
Yeah.
pretty instantaneously.
And it is interesting because before I got to the broadband world, when I was just doing insurance, I had always thought that, you see a landline phone and you think, oh, it's all copper.
It's copper, right?
But
right,
likely it's one of our member
Now it
companies.
is, for
yeah,
sure.
it's
Yeah.
VoIP.
Yeah.
So
Everything's gone VoIP. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Or
Yeah.
a lot of things.
Well,
right? Yeah.
your ability to do so much more
Yeah.
than just voice,
Yeah.
right? With a fiber background,
Sure.
right? Whether it's, our members use a hybrid use of fiber and coaxial, or
Mhm.
whether it's fiber to the premise, you're just able to transmit so much more
Of course,
data
yeah.
over that infrastructure versus twisted copper wire, that it's not even comparable. And you see a lot of nationwide sort of a movement away from twisted copper wire. So California is not the only place sort of having this discussion about what does our infrastructure look like.
Well, and nobody's like building copper, right? Like
it's so expensive.
That is my understanding.
I know of. Nobody is like starting projects where they're like, all right, we're doing copper here, right? Like we've largely moved on.
Yeah, that is my understanding. That's a pretty safe discussion.
But no, that's really interesting. So it's so funny because you would think with a cell phone it would be easier to find where you are. Because, like, in theory, you've got GPS and all the things. So I know that's not how the technology works when you're calling necessarily. But, it is kind of funny that has been the challenge, right? Where you're literally walking around with a tracking device.
All day long.
All day long. So,
if you have bars, you're being tracked.
So what are some of the issues this year, guys? Like budget, legislation? Like, what are you working on?
Yeah, budget is always, and I'll let Amanda talk about the big pieces of legislation. But budget's always a concern, right? I think California was one of the first states to heavily invest state funds in its Broadband for All proposal. The rest of the country, via the federal government, is sort of quote unquote caught up in the necessity to invest public dollars to build out to some of these more rural, remote areas that don't have the population density to make the traditional business model for broadband providers work. And so there needs to be that public-private partnership between government and private sector providers to sort of change the way the business model works in terms of those calculations. And those state grants have done that. California has a program that preceded everything that we're talking about called the CASIF program. That's been smaller scale. It's been millions of dollars instead of billions of dollars.
Yeah.
But has been, again, one of the leading states in doing that, with other states sort of catching up. But that proposal really focused on the state having a tremendous amount of resources. We were in heavily surplused budget
2 years ago.
situations. We're not in that situation now.
Right.
And I think part of the discussion that the legislature is having, and we'll see how the governor responds to that and is may revise, is the need to pivot. We don't have the robustness of the general fund. And there's already been admissions of that. If you think about part of the Broadband for All, SB 156, was this program called the Loan Loss Recovery Program. And the Loan Loss Recovery Program was to help cities develop their own municipal broadband network. Now, we've got significant concerns about a individual city's capacity to run its own broadband network, in addition to all of the other challenges that a city is facing. But they were trying to set up a financial structure to provide some support. We've proposed cutting that for, by hundreds of millions of dollars, which is just a signal that the dynamics have shifted in terms of what we're able to do and afford as a state. And therefore, the proposal and the plan moving forward of how we're going to connect everyone needs to shift as well. We hope to participate robustly in that conversation, but we're really waiting for that conversation to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's so important now, too, I feel like, because while it might not have been the case 30 years ago, like having the internet today really is a necessity. Like, obviously, it has not always been that way. And there were times when we were fine without it. When I wanted to buy Giants tickets, for example, or something like that. I was, chatting on AIM and like doing stuff that didn't really matter. But now, I mean, our education system is so dependent on it. We have people getting online degrees. We have people, banking. We have people, you really need the internet now. And that's why, it's amazing, right? That something that didn't hardly exist 30 years ago now is such an integral part of our lives. So that's why this is such an important conversation.
Yeah. And if you think about the development of the internet, it was really the private sector that sort of figured out, we can communicate more data more efficiently, quicker, and sort of grew it out of receiving the internet in the mail with your CD-ROM for 15 hours of
Yeah.
AOL to now essentially, having gig symmetrical speeds that no one actually really needs unless you're doing a lot of transmission, but gig symmetrical speeds, which is, now. But I think what's important about that is the fact that you have that private sector competition
Yeah.
and allowed for multiple technologies to innovate,
Yep.
and to bring a diversity of service packages to
Yeah.
various communities so that people have choices and can pick and choose. I think what the challenge for California is our regulatory system still thinks about anything that is an essential service and treating it like it's a monopolistic utility.
Mm.
And that's what we don't have
point.
in the broadband space. We're not a monopoly. We're not a natural monopoly. My wireline providers are competing against wireless providers,
Sure.
who are competing against satellite providers. And I think the change in the policy and the change in the mentality has to be, how does California, from a policy standpoint, nurture and monitor a competitive marketplace instead of trying to force something to look like a monopoly so that you can make it fit into a outdated regulatory scheme, versus sort of looking at how the marketplace and the consumers are viewing it, right?
I think that's an amazing point. And at the end of the day, that competition, the consumer is the one that wins, right?
Yes.
Because,
Absolutely.
that is what's going to bring prices down. That's what's going to require people to compete for that business.
Yeah, and it's working, right? I mean, if you're just monitoring, and no one really has to, but if you're monitoring the financial reports,
Sure.
the shift of customers between providers is heavy as customers are shopping for the best price and the best service.
Yep.
And it's really a healthy marketplace at this point in time. And what we fight against is, how do you maintain that? Of course, government has an appropriate role, but that role can't be so heavy-handed that you disrupt, destroy the competitive marketplace that's bringing such value to our consumers.
Right, for sure. So what's going on the legislative front?
Well, I think that's a great transition into the legislative front, right? Because we've seen this just broadly in California in business, is when things are going well, when people need a certain service or product, California tends to want to heavily regulate or heavily tax that industry, to the point where businesses start to make business decisions about whether or not to stay or grow or innovate in California, which is unfortunate. My previous career in insurance, I think, is a good highlight of businesses started to have to make business decisions because of California's regulatory environment. We do not want that for internet service providers.
Yep.
We are the home of tech. We need the internet structure. All of this conversation about AI can't happen without our infrastructure.
Right.
And without our infrastructure continuing to innovate. Our people have to be ahead of all of those entrepreneurs and innovators to make sure that the broadband holds when you're trying to do things with AI. So I think what we see this year is kind of along the same lines of the legislature looking at heavily regulating the internet service providers. We see one piece of legislation, it's AB 2239, that's looking at an FCC rule regarding digital discrimination. And to be very clear, we have always supported things that would be, if we're intentionally discriminating, we should be held liable. We have that on the cable broadband side through regulation that's been in place for 18 years. We also have the Unrest Civil Rights Act. We have that in California. Companies cannot intentionally discriminate, period.
Yep.
What the FCC rule does is try to make it so that no matter what your business decision is, if it has a disparate impact on a group, then you could be held liable for discrimination.
Wow.
The FCC rule is in the 8th Circuit Court right now. So the national associations are fighting that fight in the court system. And instead of waiting to see how that fetters out, California wants to go ahead and implement a very almost identical rule.
Wow.
So, it's just overregulation without the background of, okay, is this even constitutional?
It doesn't sound like it, but I mean, I think that's so incredible though that and we always talk about this. I had a bill last year. I won't talk about the content, but essentially, it was a current court case was going around it,
Hmm.
and the committee consultant told me, "Well, we got to wait till that clears up." It's like,
Yeah.
but then in this case, we're just we're rushing forward with it, which just doesn't seem like the right call.
Right. And then on the other side of rushing ahead is another bill that we've been discussing in the legislature for the past 4 years
Hmm.
regarding it's called DivCA, it's the Cable Broadband Providers Franchise Agreements type of thing.
Yeah.
That has been gone through the legislature now. It's the fourth time in a row. Every single year it either stops, or last year the governor vetoed it, and yet
Oh.
it's being brought up again.
Hmm.
Where, we've continued to, try to say there has been no enforcement actions against DivCA, saying that we're not in compliance with DivCA. And yet sponsors of this bill continue to contend that there should be stronger regulations regarding DivCA franchise holders. They continue to conflate broadband and our video services, because we have to remember that our members provide two different services.
Yeah.
That old cable box video
Yep.
service package that we all watched MTV on,
Yep.
that's what this is regulating.
Okay.
And so to go in and try to have stronger regulations on that service, seems a little ridiculous at this point, especially when we're looking at all of these other broadband bills
Right.
that are trying to regulate us on that service.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, and I don't remember if you said it or not, but like it is kind of similar to what we've done to the insurance market in California, where we've just year after year put so many regulations in place, and some of which should have changed with technology changes and
Yep.
improvements and things like that, but they're still on the books. And so we see these insurance companies leaving the state. We definitely don't want that for our broadband companies, right? We want to be able to provide a regulatory environment that obviously protects people, but also,
Absolutely.
allows business and competition to take place. So
Yeah, you want us to
Yeah.
continue to innovating. You want us to build out to those last 7 to 3% of people. You want us to maintain the lines in a way. Some have argued like, oh, well, why not a utility structure? Do you really want broadband to follow in the way of electricity
Right.
or water? Like, look at that infrastructure. Is that what we want for our broadband infrastructure? I don't think
preferably
people
not.
want.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's so frustrating too, getting to the disparate impact conversation, because it's the infrastructure that the companies are building that
Mhm.
is really providing the access to these things, right? So to hold those companies liable when, we saw during the pandemic, right, where there was a huge lack of internet access in certain communities.
Mhm.
And it was actually in a lot of cases, either the, broadband or wireless, or there was a bunch of different companies that mobilized
Mhm.
to help provide those kids access. Like
Mhm.
they care about
Absolutely.
those kids, right? So it's just like, it's frustrating that like the assumption is that these companies
Yeah.
don't have the best intentions or whatever.
Yeah, our corporate leaders often get frustrated about that.
Yeah.
Um, and, the operating assumption that just because you represent a corporation that you
Right.
are inherently evil
Or
Or
no,
anti-consumer is
Right,
always
right,
the
right, yeah.
interesting one, considering our business model is to have consumers.
Right,
Like, we
yeah.
want people to buy our products.
Of course, yeah.
on a monthly basis.
Yes. Yes.
Preferably, yeah. No, it's true, and it's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
it's incredible. So, well, that's good to know. So I appreciate the breakdown there. I know that we're seeing a bunch of these things. To your point, really quickly, you talked about AI and like this infrastructure, like, and I know you said like gig speed, you don't need it, but eventually we're gonna need it, right? Like,
I mean, as an
I don't know.
individual, you do not need gig symmetrical speed.
But like, what are we gonna do? Like when we talk about the infrastructure, I mean, I'm just hearing like AI is gonna take
Yeah.
so much
Yeah,
Yeah.
data consumption.
Yeah.
and power,
Yes.
and and then Web3, and you're having all these advancements
Yep.
of the internet essentially.
Yeah.
Like, what happens with the infrastructure side? Like, you know.
Well, essentially, oversimplified, you're talking about data warehouses and how do you allow those data warehouses to receive data,
Right.
compute it, analyze it, and then kick it back out in a
Got it.
usable fashion.
Yeah.
So, yes, that infrastructure needs to be robust.
Yeah.
Like, you need everything that you can get. For me and my family, that's just, binge watching Netflix and Hulu.
Yeah.
Like, our download speed,
Yeah.
probably needs to be robust, but our upload speed, because, we're not, live casting every day,
Right.
doesn't need to be as robust. That's what I meant with regards to the
Yeah.
symmetrical. I think a lot of times, because the way in which we talk about internet speeds is so foreign to individuals, you end up falling into, well, I need to have the top because the top is, of course, what I need or is what's best. And it is what's best, but no one really knows how to, like the normal lay person, if you ask them, well, based on your actual usage, what is your optimal speed?
Yep.
They wouldn't even know how to calculate it. So.
Which is why it's important to talk to your provider. Because
Yes,
I've
this
had
is
to
true.
talk to mine, and whereas they're like, okay, so you've got, I've got 2 PlayStation players in my household. I've got 2 different consoles in my household because that's the kind of household I'm in. Plus me, who's working from home sometimes. My sister-in-law, sometimes they're, doing school from my house. So, and I talked to my internet service provider and was like, okay, I've got these things. They're like, okay, well, you should really use this speed. And so they will help
They'll
you.
help you figure it out. That's actually good to know.
Yeah, because that way you're not going in and be like, well, I need a gig symmetrical. Because likely you don't need it.
And the other thing you should talk to your provider about is the layout of the house. Because the signals, like we just sort of think, oh, I have a Wi-Fi signal.
Yeah.
But a lot of times there are things, the way the house is constructed, the materials built can obstruct the signal. You may need devices that help sort of get the signal in and around a corner. And so having that conversation when the technician comes out or requesting a technician to come out and look and survey and all that stuff are all services that the providers provide. You just have to request it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm not going to let my son listen to this podcast because he's been asking me to fix his bedroom for like 5 years. The lag, Dad. The lag.
There's a parental reason for some things.
Right,
yes.
I got to get this lag thing fixed. So I've got an issue in my house for sure. But any final thoughts on broadband before we kind of close things out?
Optimistic.
Yeah.
I think we're at a point in time where you and your colleagues, the governor, can really think about how do you set California up for the next, 50 years in terms of having robust communications infrastructure. I think pivoting and making sure that you're spending limited state resources wisely so that you are not duplicating infrastructure is going to be critical. I think a lot of the plan now, to be frank, duplicates infrastructure in a way that we can no longer afford. Yeah. And so pivoting and to have the tough conversations and the real conversations about where state resources need to go is a conversation that we look forward to because, again, we want to make sure all Californians have access to the internet so we can serve as many as possible.
Totally agree. I think that's a great summary. So before I let you go, now I have to ask, because you said you're binging television shows. So what are you guys watching these days in your households?
Well, I'm a kid, so I am watching Disney Plus Bad Batch.
Oh, okay, Bad Batch.
Yeah,
all right,
it's my modern day A-Team. I love that show.
That's good stuff.
Yeah,
man.
it is.
That's good stuff. I haven't watched it yet, but I've seen it on there.
If you like the A-Team,
I do.
It's like the updated version with clones. It's amazing.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
All right, that's good.
So I can't remember if it's Netflix or Hulu, but Death and Other Details is murder mystery on a cruise boat. So that's what I've been watching. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. All right. Well, I haven't watched either of these. So I had, I forget who assembly member was on, and we picked our top like all-time Netflix shows or something.
Oh.
And we kind of like ranked them and drafted them and stuff. And it was pretty fun.
Yeah.
But I'm like, I've never watched any of the crap that you watch. Like, I don't understand. But I've been getting into the Apple TV, the Manhunt. It's like it's like the story of tracking down John Wilkes Booth after he assassinated Lincoln.
Oh, very cool.
Lincoln. It's a little intense. Honestly, like I'm like, it's not a fun show, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not like
it starts off with an assassination and goes downhill from there.
It's a very good show, but definitely not an easygoing sort of like watch. But then I've been watching a lot of Apple TV, but it's like Monarch Legacy of the Monsters or whatever, which is the Godzilla thing.
Okay.
I don't know. It's also I watch a lot of like weird stuff.
There's clearly a market for it. They didn't. I guarantee they didn't make that show just for you.
You always wonder, right? Like, who watches this stuff? And then I go and watch my shows, and I'm sure someone else is thinking, like, who watches that? Like, my wife watches like, she'll see me watching something, she'll be like, what is this? Like, I don't even understand. So, we're all different, right?
Yeah.
Well, hey guys, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having us.
Really appreciate it. If anyone has any ideas for future shows, you can email pointoforderpod@gmail.com. Of course, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and you can watch, subscribe, and follow on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Threads, and Facebook at Point of Order Pod. That'll do it for today, and see you guys later.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
See ya.